Welcome to the Dynamics of Everyday Life, where we demystify some tricky concepts and get to know ourselves a little bit better. Welcome back to the Dynamics of Everyday Life. In today's episode, I'm considering power, and more importantly, how hard we find it to hold on to our power. We might not even know that we have it. It might be something that we've been conditioned to pass straight over to other people as soon as we realise that we have any, or we might have a very complicated relationship with it. As we cast our gaze across historical landscapes, we can see that wars have been fought over who has power. Battles have raged across centuries for the power of the throne, and in today's political arena, babies are kissed as part of the marketing strategy to try and cling on to power. There's also the darker side of what people will do when wielding or trying to hold on to power, but that's not something that I'm tackling in this episode. What I'm looking at today is our own very personal relationship with our private power and the conflicts that arise within us. I've considered many ways of looking at this concept. I could take more of a sociological viewpoint around the pressures of society, but I'm likely to fall down a rabbit hole of the pluses and minuses of today's media, in particular social media. And whilst I love the idea of being Alice falling into Wonderland, that's not the particular Wonderland that I want to visit. I've never been especially adept from a technological perspective. Using social media to promote my podcast has been a steep learning curve, so I don't think that this is the avenue to explore. It's also not my thing. Psychodynamics is, so I'll be staying firmly in that camp. I just wanted to reference that there are other lenses to look at this through. Although, being somewhat biased, I do think psychodynamics is the very best. I'm going to approach this in two ways. First of all, time to get out our defence mechanism bingo cards again. We're going to be looking at projection. Projection is a very common defence mechanism, and it can be used in a variety of ways. First of all, there are the bits of ourselves that we don't like very much, and we unconsciously split these off into other people. For example, any biases which we may have that are unpleasant to us. Racism, homophobia, ageism, sexism, etc. We split these off and locate them in someone else. It's too painful to have them as part of our psychical makeup. We can also project our ideals into other people. This might be projection, but it also might be transference, which I've talked about in previous episodes. Transference is where we are responding to a person as if they were someone central to our primal years. The key thing is, what we're doing is we're unconsciously removing parts of ourselves that we don't want, and we're locating them in other people. We can assume that these parts are classed as more negative aspects of ourselves. But let's turn that idea on its head. What if we've been brought up to believe that we don't have, or shouldn't have, any power? That we aren't important? That our views don't matter? Or that we're unable to make decisions? This can happen for a variety of reasons: cultural, family backgrounds, education, or lack of. The reason itself doesn't matter. What does matter is the psychological message that we're then carrying, that we don't or shouldn't have any power. So what does our mind do when it perceives that we might have some power? Unconsciously it goes onto red alert. The siren starts screaming, warning, warning, and it does what it can to get rid of that feeling. The mind doesn't want to feel uncomfortable. I've mentioned before the concept of the pleasure principle, so it jettisons anything that's going to make us feel threatened. We project it outwards onto someone else. In relationships, we can see other people as having the power. They're able to make the decisions, not us. I've coached and supported a lot of people with relationship challenges, and one of the most common stumbling blocks that people come across is where they don't feel that they have any power, that their partner is the one who gets to make the decisions, that it's up to their partner as to how the relationship develops, whether it continues or whether it ends. It can be quite a revelation, and sometimes difficult to hear, that they too have the power to make decisions. A question I'll often ask is, what do you want? And people can look surprised, or even shocked that this can be taken into consideration, because they're so used to giving their power away. Projection is being used as a defensive strategy to keep away feelings or behaviours that we have learnt not to have as part of our psychic makeup. So the first step to claiming some power back is to start to recognise that we've been giving it away. This might not be an easy thing to come to terms with. The key thing to remember is it's a common defence mechanism and it happens a lot. So if you're recognising that this is something that happens to you, you're absolutely not alone. Whilst we're projecting outwards, we're also having unconscious material projected into us. What we decide to do with it is up to us. Let's use an example I use a lot when teaching. We've got two people who work in the same organisation. Let's call them Brian and Barry. Brian works in the HR department and Barry works in accounts. They know each other fairly well. Brian is really unhappy at work in the HR department, but he can't admit to himself that he's unhappy, as he'll have to do something about it, and he's too scared to start looking for another job. Barry in accounts is quite happy doing what he's doing. Brian really doesn't like this feeling of being unhappy, so unconsciously he starts to project this into Barry. There could be an unconscious dynamic between them where Brian is jealous of Barry and his happiness at work, and so he seeks to bring this feeling down. Barry then starts to notice that maybe he doesn't feel as perky as he normally does, but can't quite put his finger on why. If Barry is able to disavow this feeling, to shake it out of his system, then he's able to move on. If, however, he then starts to feel that perhaps he is unhappy at work, that maybe he needs to do something about these feelings of uncomfortableness, then what's taking place here is something called projective identification. Barry has introjected this projection, he's taken it into his psyche, and he now feels that it's right and appropriate that he feels this way. Projective identification is a term that was first used by Melanie Klein, and there are other more detailed explanations of this phenomena, but for our purposes today, this one is enough. Within this concept of projective identification, we're losing our power because we're becoming subservient to the unconscious processes of someone else. In effect, their unconscious feelings are overwhelming our own individual feelings and thoughts. What can we do about this? It can be unsettling to realise that you've been giving your power away. Initially, we can feel empowered and strident, deciding we're going to reclaim what's rightfully ours, and then stumble at the initial hurdle. Remember that the mind doesn't want to change. It's quite happy continuing in the way that has always worked for it, and it's going to do everything that it possibly can to hang on to its preferred way of being. There'll probably be some more defence mechanisms popping up here to hang on to the status quo. I'm thinking some rationalisation is definitely going to be raising its head. We talked quite a bit about rationalisation last week, where we looked at why we struggle to move away from certain behaviours and circumstances. Rationalisation is where we find reasons to justify our behaviour, and this is something that's extremely likely to come up if all of a sudden we discover that we've been acting in ways which might not be in our best interests after all. My invitation to you this week is for you to consider how powerful or in control you feel in your relationships and friendships. I'm not meaning in some kind of dictatorial Dick Dastardly style. What I'm thinking about is how equitable you feel in these relationships. Is there give and take? Or are you doing all the giving? It's no secret that as well as being a huge psychodynamics and Freud fan, I'm also a big fan of Matthew Hussey, a very successful dating and relationship coach. He once did a video on social media where a woman in the audience at one of his events said to him, "Why does he treat me this way?" when talking about her boyfriend. And Matthew answered, "Because you let him." Somewhat brutal, but it makes a point. And I think this point holds true here. If you're going to give away your power, unconsciously or consciously, then it's extremely likely that the person you're giving it to is going to take it. I want to encourage you to recognise your own power and know that holding on to it is more than okay, even if that feels scary at times. Looking at ourselves at this level can be challenging and unnerving as we develop our awareness, so I'd always encourage that you do this at your own speed. If you feel you need some extra help around this, then I've put together a PDF resource sheet and you can find the link for this in the show notes. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Dynamics of Everyday Life. Please hit the follow button for future episodes and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow me on Instagram at The Dynamics of Everyday Life or find me on LinkedIn at Julia Rogers. I'd love to hear from you and hear your thoughts on dynamics. The Dynamics of Everyday Life is brought to you by Coaching 42 and the fabulous team at the Podcast Boutique.